All right, indulge me for a minute. It's been a long summer, and you've all forgotten a little bit of Mark, haven't you? So a little bit of review won't hurt. Mark is in two sections, divides neatly right down the middle at that moment that we call Caesarea Philippi, the confession that took place there. That's a moment of unveiling. Up until that point, Mark has been emphasizing for us the authority of Jesus' person, but at least the players on the stage never really identify the office that's associated with that authority. Now, the narrator tells us, Mark tells us, God tells us at the baptism of Jesus, the demons know who he is, but the people themselves who are part of the story as it unfolds never quite get it. And so for the first half of Mark's gospel, we have this man who mysteriously speaks with such powerful, weighty words. He acts, and things obey, nature obeys, diseases flee, demons are terrorized by him, and everybody is wondering, what is this? But then when we reach Caesarea Philippi, the veil is pulled back, and Peter says, "You are the Messiah. You are the Christos, the christened one, the anointed one." And from that point on, Mark's gospel is now unpackaging the authority of the office. The authority of the person, now the authority of the office, both themes united, of course, as we pursue an understanding of Jesus as Messiah. Jesus as Messiah is combining three great roles from the Old Testament. Prophet. Prophets were anointed. They were, in a sense, small m messiahs in the Old Testament. They spoke on behalf of God to the people. Priests were anointed. They spoke on behalf of the people to God. So those two roles were more or less complementary. The third role, king, combining, in a sense, both of those and really reinforcing each of them. There's a dual aspect to the kingly role as well, because the king represented the authority of God to the people, and submitting to the king was in some ways an act of submitting to God, and at the same time the king stood for the submission of the people before God. And so he led the people in worship, submitting to God, and at the same time he spoke with the authority that came from God. In other words, in a sense, to be the king represented a bit of both the prophetic and priestly ministry, and to fully be Messiah, prophet, priest, and king, you could only really perfectly do it if in some way or other you happen to be fully God and fully man, because it's a dual capacity combined in one person. And that's why the church has historically confessed that the Messiah is two natures in one person. Chalcedon said, "He is vera homo and vera deus," truly God, truly man, two natures perfectly joined in one person, yet each nature retaining its own attributes. And we have believed that the Messiah could not be the Messiah perfectly unless he is both and yet one. And that's the affirmation we've made, and I doubt that Peter quite got all of that. You know, he hadn't read the canons of Chalcedon, which were in 451, when he said this in 30 AD. But he had some idea that this was an amazing thing. You are the long-anticipated, long-expected Messiah. All of those great offices rolled into one, and Jesus gives his endorsement. And then Jesus, from that moment on, as Mark tells the story, heads for Jerusalem. He's the king heading for his capital, because Jerusalem is the center from which this king should rule. And last year we were looking at the last half of Mark's gospel, and we noted that that half is itself in three chunks. Chunk number one I have here, the character of the kingdom. So if you were in the class last spring, you recall we were tracing in some ways how Mark paints a picture of the kingdom on the journey from Caesarea Philippi to Jerusalem. And we learned that this kingdom is not what we expected. We thought the kingdom was going to be a place of Prestige, pomp and circumstance, jockeying for position, one-upsmanship, competition. I want this role, I want that one, Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, this and that, negotiate. And no, Jesus says, wait a minute. You want to be great in the kingdom, you need to work your way down. You become the servant of those who are the least of these. You receive this kingdom like a child, or you won't even get into it. But all of this kind of egotistical maneuvering has no place in this kingdom. It's a hard lesson to learn. We're still trying to figure that out. As in the church, we still fall prey to all kinds of glory-seeking behavior, as church history so eloquently testifies. Well, that was where we left it off. The last story of last year was blind Bartimaeus, Jericho. From there, Jesus crossed the fords of the Jordan, took the Jericho road, and we find him now, and this is the second chunk, in what I'm calling the crisis of the kingdom. Crisis, the Greek word, means judgment. This is Sunday, Monday, Tuesday of Holy Week. This is a trial. Not a trial of Jesus, a trial by Jesus of the city, of the temple, of the leadership. He conducts a trial, he renders his judgment, and the judgment is, you are found guilty. And therefore the kingdom is taken from you who were properly supposed to be the fiduciaries of it, and given to a nation worthy of it. Your house is left to you desolate. Not one stone is going to be left upon another. This place is going to be wiped out, laid bare, and in fact another is going to take its place. A new Jerusalem, a new temple, a new priesthood is all going to be put in place, and you are in a position of choosing the old or the new. New wineskins are old. What's it going to be? And that was the outcome of the trial. It begins when Jesus enters the city, welcomed as a king, but soon enough the treason plotted against him is going to take over the story. The last chunk I'm calling the creation of the kingdom. I don't like that word quite, but it starts with C. And I'm a kind of OCD, for alliteration, so there it is. But what I mean is he establishes the foundation of the new kingdom. He lays the constitution in place, we call it the new covenant, out of which this new kingdom is going to be created. So there you are. That's kind of this thumbnail sketch of where we've been and where we're going. Verse 1, now when they drew near Jerusalem to Bethphage and Bethany, to the Mount of Olives, he sent two of his disciples. They're drawing near to Jerusalem. You know that Mark has been telling us all along they were heading for Jerusalem. Biblically, Jerusalem is the holy city. It is the capital, not simply of Israel. From the biblical point of view, Jerusalem is in a sense the capital of the world. It's Jerusalem, of which it is said in the Old Testament repeatedly, it is there that I have put my name. In Jerusalem you find the temple, which was a house of prayer not for Israel, but for the nations. All the world was supposed to resort to and view Jerusalem as having a kind of elevated status among them. Not an empire, not a totalitarian kind of hegemony, but simply a recognition that this is the place where God had peculiarly established the center of worship and the center of his presence. That's why the book of Revelation, I believe, calls Jerusalem the great city which reigns over the kings of the earth. But the book of Revelation highlights that the holy city had become the harlot city. It had become a Babylon. The irony that the great enemy of God's people in the Old Testament is now united with what was supposed to be the holy city itself. And so here we have Jesus arriving in a city that is soon enough going to murder him treasonously by Friday after the Sunday that he entered to these celebrations. So, what happens in Holy Week? The king is welcomed on Sunday by these crowds. We're looking at that story this morning. He will come back on Monday and run a trial. He's going to look at the temple. He's going to examine what's happening there. He's not going to be happy. He'll drive out the money changers for sure. But then he comes on Tuesday and gives his sentence, his verdict. You're found guilty of the crime of idolatry and treason against your covenant Lord. And he gives the pronouncements of judgment that I was mentioning earlier. Wednesday passes quietly without notice, and then the rest of the week is the rest of the story. Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, in which a new kingdom is created. It begins on Thursday in what we call the Last Supper, in which Jesus spells out the terms of what he calls a new covenant. This new covenant you might call something like a constitution. You know, civilizations usually are rooted in constitutions. We as Americans are proud of our Constitution. It's the longest surviving constitution, friends, in the history of the world. And we should be proud of that. Jesus put in place a constitution called the New Covenant. Our Constitution as Americans had to be ratified. 9 of the 13 colonies had to buy off or it wouldn't fly. The Constitution Jesus put in place also had to be ratified. But it was not ratified by a popular vote. In the ancient world, this kind of covenant was ratified in what was called a cutting ceremony. And so you'll hear the expression commonly, a covenant cutting ceremony. It was the way that treaties were formed and the way sometimes that constitutions within a civil order were formed. Well, in this case, there had to be a covenant-cutting ceremony by which this constitution, this new covenant, would be ratified. But in this case, the one that is going to be cut is not simply an animal, it's Jesus who says, "This is my body cut for you. This is my blood poured out for you. I am the heart of this covenant-cutting ceremony." And so in a great irony, the bitter enemies of Jesus become the priests who actually offer the sacrifice, the paschal lamb, by which they create the situation of their own undoing. Because this new covenant is going to give rise to the kingdom now that has been expected. And unless they repent and turn and align themselves with King Jesus, they will go down with the ship Titanic. They're going to go down because they didn't recognize him, but in fact maintained their hostility against him. We would never have known for sure if any of this was true, except that on Sunday morning, God screamed the vindication of his Son from heaven, raising him from the dead, and at that moment we knew everything Jesus claimed was in fact true. Every extravagant statement he made, everything about himself, every demand he made of people was something that we now have to take as the very Word of God among us, because in fact the resurrection becomes the proof positive for them and for all eternity that Jesus was precisely who he claimed to be. And so this is the week we're looking at. Every line of it, every word of it, every story in it is loaded with rich drama, and we're only now just walking through the front door. So, they came to Bethphage and Bethany. Jesus left Caesarea Philippi, stopped off briefly at Capernaum, went over to the east side of the Jordan, which was common, avoiding Samaria, came down to what's called the fords of the Jordan, not far from Jericho, entered back into the west side, passed through Jericho. That's where he ran into blind Bartimaeus. Luke tells us the story of Zacchaeus. That all took place in Jericho. 17 miles from Jericho to Jerusalem. He makes that journey. The towns that he encounters on approaching Jerusalem will be, first of all, Bethany and Bethphage, which were about 2 miles distant. You see a really great view of Jerusalem as you're coming over the Mount of Olives. This is what it looks like today. Conspicuous in the middle of it is, of course, the Dome of the Rock. Because, just as Jesus said, the temple that was originally there had been moved and not one stone had been left upon another. It has never been rebuilt. In my opinion, it never will be rebuilt. But if you'd have been approaching Jerusalem in that time, you would have seen conspicuously in the same spot the glorious temple, Herod's temple. Josephus says it was one of the wonders of the ancient world. It shone with a kind of splendor as the sun would reflect off of its golden edifice and so on. So that's what you can kind of imagine it there. That's what they would see as they were approaching it. Jesus probably spent Saturday at Bethany. Sunday, he's I'm sorry, my screen is a little dim here, and I have to kind of... Sunday morning, went through Bethphage, crossing the Mount of Olives, and into the Kidron Valley. The Mount of Olives itself, this is the view of the Mount of Olives from Jerusalem, kind of the reverse perspective we were just looking at, was a low range, about 2 miles long, visible from the city, separated by a little valley you hear of in the Old Testament called the Kidron Valley. The Mount of Olives that Jesus crossed in entering Jerusalem or approaching Jerusalem is referred to occasionally in the Old Testament. Invariably, it tends to be associated with Messiah. And if you've read those texts, of course, you'll recognize that. One of the better known ones in Zechariah, the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. And in that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which faces Jerusalem on the east. So Jesus is approaching, he's left Bethany, he's on his way toward the Mount of Olives, and he sends 2 of his disciples ahead, we don't know who they were, says to them, go into the village opposite you, and as soon as you've entered it, you'll find a colt tied on which no one has sat. Loose it and bring it to me. The village opposite you presumably is Bethphage. So he's left Bethany, he's on his way, he sends these 2 guys ahead. As they enter, he tells them they're going to find a colt tied. The common view has been that this was Jesus exercising prophetic knowledge. Prophets in the Old Testament would sometimes know stuff, that wasn't necessarily plainly visible. That's been the common view. Jesus simply understood by a kind of divine prescience, prophetic insight, what would happen. But I did appreciate one commentator who, I think tongue-in-cheek, was nevertheless speculating maybe Jesus had an underground. This was a British commentator, and he was still freshly remembering the underground, the French resistance under the Nazis in the Second World War. And of course, they, to some significant effect, were able to cause some grief to the Nazis during those years, as you know from your studies of that time in history. And Jesus was this commentator was raising the question about Jesus. Maybe he had an underground. Maybe he'd actually sent this off in advance, send these people, arrange this whole deal. But the real point of his speculation was, does Jesus have an underground in your city? I don't know. Does Jesus have an underground in Spokane, Washington? If he does, I hope I'm in it. I hope I'm part of it. Does Jesus have those who are resisting powers of evil in the culture, resisting a usurping authority to establish the legitimate authority of his rule? I don't know, but I hope so. I don't know how it was that Jesus knew about this donkey there in the city. I think it probably was the former of those options, but one way or another, there it was, just as he had predicted. A colt was tied. Usually, I think when we hear about the triumphal entry and the co-opting of this colt, we think of a donkey. That's really what this is. It's a young donkey, a colt. We think of it as being really representative of the notion of humility. And I don't know, I think that's what I've heard the most. Maybe you have too. That's certainly part of it. But it's not the main thing about the colt that should be understood in terms of the triumphal entry. The colt was not viewed mainly as a humble animal. In the Old Testament, kings rode on donkeys. Prophets rode on donkeys. Judges rode on donkeys. Gideon was said to have 30 sons, and they all rode on white donkeys. This wasn't exactly a display of humility. This was really a kind of a prestige deal. But what the donkey did stand for was the notion of peace. The donkey was viewed as an animal of peace rather than a weapon of war, and that was its most dominant feature. And that's really what it stands for in terms of the triumphal entry. You may know that Moses had given what was commonly called the king's law to the people of Israel in Deuteronomy 17. The king in some ways was the least free person in Israel because he not only had all the laws that bound everybody else, but he had an additional set of rules that applied only to the king. One of which was he could not multiply horses. He could have as many donkeys as he wanted. See? But horses were viewed as a weapon of conquest, of aggression. Horses were the device that ancient rulers used to travel great distances quickly, to do empire building, conquest, domination. That's what horses were about. The kings of Israel were not permitted to operate with that kind of philosophy. They were permitted to have donkeys, but you really have a hard time imagining a king, thundering into battle on the backs of a bunch of donkeys. It just doesn't quite fit, does it? Because donkeys are viewed as animals of peace. It was commonly understood among the rabbinic teachers that Messiah himself would enter Jerusalem on the back of a donkey. This wasn't some kind of surprise, and you know that because the Old Testament, of course, says it. Zechariah 9, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, your king is coming to you. He is just and having salvation, lowly." There's a humility element there. "And riding on a donkey, a colt, the foal of a donkey." But notice this, "I will cut off the chariot from Ephraim." Chariots were weapons of war. "I will cut off the horse from Jerusalem." Horses were weapons of war. "The battle bow shall be cut off." Battle bows, weapons of war. "He shall speak peace to the nations. His dominion shall be from sea to sea, and from the river to the ends of the earth." Not spreading that peace at the point of a sword, but at the point of grace and the gospel. And from the time that Jesus entered Jerusalem till this, wherever the gospel of the King has been faithfully proclaimed, wherever the redemption that we find in him has been provided to a people, peace has inevitably followed in its wake. This has been the story of human history since the time of Christ. And we are still part of that story as we continue to see the expansion of his kingdom from sea to sea and from the rivers to the ends of the earth. We're told no one has sat on this donkey. That suggests its sacred purpose. It was not commonly used. This was a virginal donkey, as it were, one that had never been ridden before, unbroken, apparently, but apparently it didn't create any problems for Jesus. If anyone says to you, "Why are you doing this?" say, "The Lord has need of it, and immediately he will send it here." One commentator speculated, how many times do you suppose in the history of the Christian movement sermons have been preached on Jesus' statement, "The Lord has need of it"? And the question that was being raised there by this particular commentator was, what do you have that the Lord needs? I got to thinking about that. What do I have that the Lord needs? I don't know if you respond the way I do to that. It's like we get into this sort of super modest, I don't have anything that the Lord needs. Come on. I don't have much. Come on. I don't have any great talent, this or that, whatever. Good heavens. What in the world do I have that the Lord needs? I appreciated Bill Robinson's sermon 2 weeks ago on Naaman, one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament, Naaman. But maybe you remember when Bill was here a year ago, and he preached not on Naaman, but on Moses. Remember that? The burning bush confronts Moses there and says to him, "What's in your hand?" And Moses looks in his hands. "What is that?" "It's a shepherd's staff." Okay, it's probably one of those common implements in the ancient world. Nothing special. I don't think it was a Mark IV leather, kind of special edition. It was just a shepherd's staff. No big deal. "What's in your hand, Moses?" "Well, shepherd's staff." Do you realize the career that shepherd's staff had? It was that shepherd's staff was the instrument by which Moses, through the power of God, unleashed plagues against the Pharaoh and against Egypt, culminating in the Exodus. And it was the shepherd's staff, the same one that he held up out over the Red Sea, and it parted so the people could cross on dry land. And it was the shepherd's staff that he held up when the Israelites were fighting the Amalekites and victoriously defeated them. And it was the shepherd's staff that he struck the rock and water came flowing out. Again and again we find that shepherd's staff is playing a pretty strategic role. I got news for you. It wasn't the staff. It wasn't like that was some kind of special. Any staff would have done. It just happened to be the one that was in his hand. What do you have that the Lord needs? Never be modest about it. It was never in the staff in the first place. It was never in anything we have in the first place. It's the power of God in that thing that makes it useful in building His kingdom. So the Lord needed a donkey. Not that this donkey had some kind of incredible special breeding and was one of uniquely in the history of the earth. Nothing like. No. It was just another donkey, but it just happened to be the one ordained by God for that purpose at that moment. And, of course, we hear notably, Mark puts it in these words, the Lord has need of him. The word here, it's the only time Mark does it quite this way, referring to Jesus as the Lord. And in fact, it's in Jesus' own lips that we hear those words. Tell them the Lord has need of it. You know your biblical history well enough to know that in the Hebrew version of the Old Testament, the Tetragrammaton, Yahweh, the proper name for God, was considered so holy that the Jewish people would not say it. And so they did a circumlocution. They put instead the word the Lord. Hokurios is the way that's rendered in the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, and it was commonly used in the time of Jesus to refer to God, the Lord. And when Mark now strategically puts those words into the mouth of Jesus, tell them the Lord has need of it. Any sober reader with integrity would say that was nothing less than a full-on claim to deity by Christ when he put those words into the mouths of those disciples and sent them looking for a donkey. The Lord has need of it. Well, off they went. And as advertised, they found a colt tied by the door outside in the street, and they loosed it. Some of those who were there said, "What do you think you're doing? Loosing the colt?" And they spoke to them just as Jesus had commanded, and they let them go. This whole story, sometimes I think we read the story of the triumphal entry. What's this? Why so much about the colt and getting the colt? Why is that such a big deal? It's all the gospel writers mention it. Well, it's because it's painting a picture of Jesus as king. That's the whole point. The details of this story in every element of them are telling us this is the king, this is the Messiah, this is the one who not only rules Israel or rules the church, he rules the cosmos. And all of these little details are suggesting something of that to us. Even the colt, the donkey, had a very kingly kind of identity. We saw the text in Zechariah. Think about this one. This comes from clear back in Genesis. This is part of the patriarchal blessing in which Jacob is pronouncing a blessing toward the end of his life on his 12 sons. And Judah is singled out for special recognition. Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise, already elevating his status. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies, suggesting conquest and rule. Your father's children shall bow down before you. His father's children were his siblings, but they would bow down before him. Judah is a lion's whelp, hence the expression, the lion of the tribe of Judah. And as a lion who, from the prey, my son, you have gone up, bows down and lies down as a lion, and as a lion who shall rouse him, that lion of the tribe of Judah image. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, or a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes. There's a messianic prophecy. Rule is going to abide in Judah until the culminating ruler comes. To him shall be the obedience of the people, suggesting his royalty. Binding his donkey to the vine, and his donkey's colt to the choice vine, he washed his garments in wine. These are kingly descriptions. And his clothes in the blood of grapes. His eyes are darker than wine, his teeth whiter than milk. That whole expectation that kind of comes down through the Old Testament includes within it, on strategic moments, the colt, the donkey, as the emblem of this kingly rule. And that's part of why we hear about the donkey in the story of the triumphal entry. The way that Jesus took the donkey, commandeering it for royal use. Most of us in this room have not had experience up close and personal with living under a monarchy, We're happy we live in a Republican government with a constitution, that's all good, but most people who've lived down through the history of the world have lived in monarchical societies of some description. If you live in an absolute monarchy, the king is understood as having any claim to anything you have, anytime, anywhere, and you view it not simply as, not as an imposition, but as a privilege. If you lived in France in the 1700s under, Louis XIV, and he came to town and said, I want to sleep in your bed tonight, I want to drive your car, I want to eat your food, you didn't view that as an imposition. You viewed that as the most extraordinary moment of privilege you could possibly imagine. You would have been rejoicing for the rest of your life to get that kind of attention from the king. There was no protest that was put up. This is the way it is in a monarchy. And here's Jesus acting in a very monarchical fashion, is he not? Just tell them the Lord has need of it, they'll send it. There's not going to be any protest, no contracts. Okay, now was that 24 hours? Do you want an insurance rider on that? Nobody's working on it. No. You just send that donkey. This is not a rental agreement. Because that's the way kings operate, and that's the way Jesus operates. The sacredness of the colt itself. This is only one of many details that we see here. This colt had never been ridden before. The implication is it would never be ridden again. The Mishnah says that no one can ride the king's horse except the king. All of this is just painting this picture of Jesus, the king, coming to a city. Then they brought the colt to Jesus. They threw their clothes on it. He sat on it. Many spread their clothes on the road. Others cut down leafy branches from the trees, spread them on the road. This spontaneous response was typical in the ancient Near Eastern world. What they're doing here may strike us as a little odd, but it was the kind of thing you did when you knew you were in the presence of royalty. Taking off your cloak, laying down palm branches, that was the sort of thing that was done. And again, it says that in the minds of the people, there was an understanding, this is the king. This is the king who is entering. There's been interesting echoes of this down through history when people have come in the name of King Jesus and been welcomed. We don't hear much about this and don't appreciate it, but more than once, the history of the Christian movement has testified to that. My favorite example of it is our own Chief Spokane Gary, famous here in Spokane. We have monuments to Spokane Gary, Chief Gary Park, Chief Gary School. We've got a bust of Chief Gary on the side of the Spokesman Review building. We have monuments and tributes to him here and there. Virtually nobody in Spokane knows diddly about Chief Spokane Gary. They just know he's some kind of great Native American from way back. Let me tell you something. Before any white missionaries ever showed up in this region, Chief Spokane Gary was the most famous native in the area. He traveled upwards of 200 miles in every direction from this region where we live, carrying that big King James Bible that he picked up at the Red River Mission as a teenager, and where he learned to read it and understand it. And he went to native villages over and over, here and there, and everywhere he went, they went out and met him as if he were an angel from heaven. And they sat and listened to him in rapt attention as he would, as best he could, explain the content of this, what was called by them the white man's book of heaven. And he explained to them the person of Christ, and many, many native people came to faith in Christ. It's called The Forgotten Awakening, in a book that was published a few years ago, and you can get it by the end of this week if you go on Amazon and look for that title, The Forgotten Awakening. It details and documents this astonishing moment in which this man was received here and there throughout this region, proclaiming the news of King Jesus. David Livingstone had something of that experience as he worked his way alone through Africa, arriving in various native villages, and they almost recognized on the spot that he was bringing something special. This kind of thing is an echo of the moment in which these people, in a spontaneous eruption of recognition, saw who this was, and they began to do what you do in the presence of royalty. They cut down these leafy branches. They laid down their cloaks, a celebration for a king. You have an interesting examples of this in the Old Testament. A guy named Jehu was once anointed king in Israel. He was anointed by one of the sons of the prophets who then ran off. And Jehu came back to his command, and they said, well, what was that about? And Jehu says, this guy said to me, thus says the Lord, I've anointed you king over Israel. Each man hasten to take off his garment and put it under him on top of the steps. See, that's the kind of thing they did. And these people now are recognizing something much bigger. Bethphage means house of dates, and they probably got their branches from those date palms that were there. Those who went before and those who cried out, saying, Hosanna, blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. These are probably people from Galilee, largely. These were people who may have been with Jesus when he fed the 5,000. Some of these were people who had been healed by Jesus. Some of these were people who had listened to his sermons. Jesus was well known in Galilee. He was a popular character in Galilee, and many, we hear, traveled with him for Passover from Galilee to Jerusalem. And it's probably those who now, recognizing and sensing the wonder of this moment, are just bursting forth in this kind of exclamation of praise. What they say is Hosanna, means roughly save us, or oh save. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. That's a messianic statement. Psalm 118 verse 25. So Jesus is now the king. He's entering the capital of the world as the king, celebrated by this crowd who, even though they're earnest in their celebration, don't have a clue what's actually going on. It's so much bigger than what they could imagine. And even for them, it was pretty big. But it had to happen. There was an inevitability about this that the cosmos demanded. Jesus said, if they don't rejoice, the stones will cry out. If galaxies, 1 billion of them, 1 billion miles away, have any consciousness, they were watching this event and celebrating. The angels of heaven were celebrating. The universe, the creation, was celebrating that moment, that day. And there had to be exclamations of praise. It had to happen. And so all of them joined together, whether they understood it or not, in this remarkable display of recognizing this one. Mark's readers needed to hear that, of course, because they were suffering under the persecution of a pipsqueak tyrant named Nero, and they needed to be reminded that there was a vastly greater ruler, and that Nero couldn't take his next breath but by the permission of King Jesus. And they could therefore take some comfort in the fact that nothing was spinning out of control, even in the time that they were facing those persecutions. Blessed is the kingdom of our father David that comes in the name of the Lord. This may be the culminating expression of this entire statement. He's the one that represents the kingdom of our father David. 1,000 years before this event took place, David ruled in Israel. David conquered Jerusalem. David gave Jerusalem, the city now being entered by the son of David. David gave it the name, the City of David. It was this city that was therefore singled out for that kind of special recognition from that point on. And so it's interesting that now 1,000 years later, this one who had been anticipated as the son of David arrives in the city of his great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather to claim it, and these people know it, and so they attribute to him the kingdom that comes in the name of our father David. My time's running out, so I'm going to really truncate this little thing, but you know what happened with David. He wanted to build a house for God. Nathan gave his initial approval, but then came back later and said, do you want to build a house for me? No, David. I'll tell you what, the Lord is going to build a house for you. I haven't demanded that I have a big house built for me, but one thing, David, I want you to understand that you are going to have a dynasty that will extend vastly beyond anything you might have suspected. This promise culminates, it's called the Davidic covenant, in these words: when your days are fulfilled and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you who will come from your body. This refers in the first instance to Solomon, but of course we see immediately that it's looking far beyond Solomon. I will establish his kingdom and shall build a house for my name. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, he shall be my son. Your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. And there is a foreverness about that we keep hearing, don't we? And now Jesus comes as this one who is going to be ruling, friends, forever. He is the king coming to his capital. The rest of the Old Testament repeats this theme. I know you know this, so I'm just reminding you. David himself wrote in Psalm 18, great deliverance he gives to his king, shows mercy to his anointed, to David and his descendants forever. Later in Psalms, the Lord has sworn in truth to David and will not turn from it. I'll set upon your throne the fruit of your body. Therefore I will make the horn of David grow. I'll prepare a lamp for my anointed. Isaiah repeatedly refers to this Davidic expectation of the increase of his government and peace. There will be no end upon the throne of David and over his kingdom, to order and establish it with judgment and justice from this time forward, even forever. The zeal of the Lord will perform it. Incline your ear and come to me. Hear, and your soul shall live, and I will make an everlasting covenant with you, the sure mercies of David. Indeed, I've given him as a witness to the people, a leader and commander for the people. Jeremiah, after Isaiah, same deal. Behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, I will raise to David a branch of righteousness. A king will reign and prosper, execute judgment. Ezekiel, after him, I will establish one shepherd over them, and he shall feed them, my servant David. He shall feed them and be their shepherd, and I, the Lord, will be their God, my servant David, a prince among them. That's only a sampling. I think you're well aware that there's plenty of other texts that make specific reference to this expectation related to a son of David who would rule forever. And this, friends, was the moment when this David, this son of David, this messianic character, this king and God among us, came into his capital city in order to establish a kingdom of which we are honored to be part to this day. Well, it concludes, Jesus went into Jerusalem and into the temple. The Messiah was the first one and only one in history that could combine the role of prophet and priest and king. It was never permitted for one person to hold all those offices. But along comes Messiah, and that's why he would rule not from a palace, not from a government building, but from a temple. And so he goes to the house of his rule in the city that is his capital and wants to do a little look-see. So when he had looked around at all things, doesn't say a word apparently, just looking around, as the hour was already late, he went to Bethany and with the 12. Didn't say anything that Sunday, but believe me, some fireworks went off the next day. And that's what we're going to start looking at next week. So he goes into Jerusalem to the temple. He looks at everything. The hour's late. He goes out to Bethany. Sunday school lesson. Point one, question one. What do you have that the king needs? Don't give me any modest answer. Anything you have can be that shepherd's crook that Moses had, which was used so mightily by a man of faith to accomplish and really change the course of history. Who do you know that should hear the king's good news? Chief Gary went to little villages all through this region with his King James Bible, was welcomed as an angel of God. That story has been repeated countless times, and I bet there's somebody that lives close to you, who's related to you, that you work with, that you otherwise know, who's just welcoming or just waiting for you to bring to them that same good news. This is no time to be shy. The king is ruling. He governs the universe. Our great privilege is to let people in on that and give them an opportunity to get right with the king and be reconciled to him. But where do you resist? Jesus went into Jerusalem, And on the one hand, there was a great crowd welcoming him and cheering him, and on the other hand, there were people who were plotting his destruction at that very moment, figuring out how they could get rid of this guy. Every one of us is a little Jerusalem in that sense. Every one of us has the flesh and the spirit, do we not? Every one of us has that part of us that rejoices in King Jesus, and that part of us that is plotting his destruction. And the smartest thing we can do is, as Paul says, mortify the flesh, feed the spirit, do those things that pursue a life of obedience to Christ, and put out that treasonous element that continues to reside in each one of us. Amen? That's it.